Hello, and welcome to our first Ask the Expert session that we're hosting as Adecco. This is available to our candidates and our customers. And today we're going to be talking about navigating vaccine mandates in the workplace. It's a really important topic at the moment because it's something where there is a lot of competing and quite confusing information out there. There's multiple sources of information, but there isn't really one source of truth. So we're in a situation in the US at the moment where we are looking at multiple orders on both a state and federal and also personal level around vaccination status within the workplace. As Adecco, we are working with over 160 of our largest customers to provide counsel back on some of this as a topic. And we are also working as Adecco on our own workforce, thinking about how, as a federal contractor, we would have to protect our people going into 2022. However, with the news that the main orders have been stayed last week, obviously this leads to change and even more confusion within the market. So we wanted to react quite quickly and do a webinar that brought in our experts from the business to consult with you in the market. So I'm delighted to be joined here today by my colleagues, Vanessa and Donna. My name is Johnny Stoker. I'm the SVP of Adecco Americas. I have the privilege of working with our candidates, our customers, and our colleagues across the business intelligence, sales, and marketing disciplines. I'm joined by Vanessa Hodgerson, who's our VP of Employment and our counsel in the business, and then also Donna Scholz, who is our VP of HR Compliance. And this team have been spending a lot of time with our customer base over the last few months, helping to advise, consult, and navigate this environment with which we find ourselves in. We wanted to spend some time today with you as a population to go over some of our experience, talk about what we're seeing within the market, and how we as a business, combined with our customer base, is reacting to this environment that is changing on a weekly basis. So what is the environment? The environment that we find ourselves in is one where we are pushing to increase vaccination status. It's one where we are trying to keep our candidates and our employees safe, but there is a lot of confusion around what's legal, what's federal, what's state-based, and what else is happening within the external market. Some customers are introducing their own vaccination mandates. Some customers aren't introducing vaccination mandates. All of these things can create commercial impact. What we do know is that of the eligible population, 72% aged 18 and above have the vaccination status that would be required to meet some of these federal mandates. So the number still needs to continue to increase into 2022 and beyond, despite the fact that these vaccination mandates have been stayed. So coming to our webinar and the experts, I'm joined by two people who've spent a lot of time looking at this. Vanessa, you're the lawyer, so I'm going to come to you first and ask, what's going on? There seems to be a few of these things out there at the moment that's causing a lot of confusion in the market.
Yeah, thanks, Johnny. I put a slide here that can kind of provide a visual for the types of policies and mandates that came out, and we can kind of walk through each one together. On the far left-hand side, you're going to see a column that has company policy. Prior to all of these federal mandates coming out, we saw clients actually adopting mandatory vaccination policies on their own accord. Maybe they did so in anticipation of one of these orders coming out, or maybe they did so from a social perspective and trying to keep the workplace as safe as possible. Under a company policy perspective, before these mandates were issued, companies had a lot of flexibility in how they wanted to draft that policy and who they wanted to apply it to. For the most part, the policies really didn't pose a whole lot of legal risk back then, so long as, of course, you complied with medical and religious exemptions, because those are always going to be a required accommodation for workers in the workplace for those who qualify. Then in October, November timeframe, we started seeing these federal mandates drop. The first one is Executive Order 14042. This one came out under the Biden administration, of course, and President Biden basically said, if you're going to do business with the federal government, you have a contract with the federal government, you're going to have to comply with Executive Order 14042. In a nutshell, it requires, if this language is going to appear in certain contracts executed on certain dates, there's a lot of variables there. But for the most part, all of your workers who are working on or in connection with a federal government contract must be vaccinated. There was no testing option, so it's not a choice. Everyone in the work site, if you fall under this executive order, was going to have to be vaccinated by a certain date. Of course, there's medical and religious exemptions required for those who qualify. The kind of big shocker from that executive order when all the FAQs were actually issued was that it was going to have to apply to even remote workers. So if you didn't have anybody sitting in a building, you had people working remote in isolation in their own living room or home office, they were actually going to have to be vaccinated. And then the OSHA ETS is the regulation that came from OSHA. We all know what OSHA is. It's been around a long time. It governs workplace safety. It issued these emergency temporary standards that basically did give employers the option to give employees the ability to choose between testing or vaccination. So it's going to apply to any workforce with over 100 or more workers. And by a certain date, you were going to have to create a policy that was either going to require everyone to be vaccinated or to provide the option to test weekly for COVID-19. And then you had medical and religious exemptions also that had to be issued to those who qualify. And then on the far right, you have the CMS rule. The CMS rule is going to apply to mostly healthcare settings and those also conducting business with the federal government to the extent they receive certain federal funding, right? You also, the healthcare setting, however, the CMS wasn't necessarily new to them, especially if they were sitting in one of the many, many states that had already passed certain state laws governing healthcare settings and high-risk areas like prisons or senior care living. Back in kind of the late summer, early fall, we had already seen a lot of states starting to adopt those laws, which is why some of our clients in the healthcare setting were probably some of the first to pass or adopt vaccination policies before these federal laws even dropped. However, as of last week, all three of these federal orders have now been stayed by a trial court. So they came, these trial court orders came at varying speeds and at varying degrees of which law they were enjoining and in which state they were enjoining. And so HR and legal were scrambling, trying to keep up with all of those variables. But if you celebrate Christmas, you received a Christmas miracle last week because all three have officially been stayed by the trial court. And now we're simply going to be watching and waiting to see what the appellate court and then likely what the Supreme Court is going to ultimately do with these three mandates.
It's a really great overview. I mean, I know that you talked about scrambling. I know that Donna and the team have been, as a federal contractor, Adecco itself has been looking at this a lot over the last month and a half, and the staying of the order last week was a surprise to us too. When you combine that with the fact we're also consulting with over 160 of our largest customers nationally on what to do with each of these, I think the visibility and the overview is incredibly helpful. So thank you. What does it mean now that the three have been stayed though? Does this mean we just relax and we don't have to do anything anymore? There's no more preparation needed? What's your advice on kind of next steps?
Well, I'm a planner, so my advice would not be to sit back and relax. And in fact, from a practical perspective, although these executive orders and these federal mandates have all been stayed, we don't know yet what is to come. We don't know what the appellate courts are going to do with them, and we don't ultimately know what the Supreme Court is going to do. They could all stay enjoined, meaning they're going to stay. They're just going to go away on their through the court system. They could also be revised, right? There could be certain parts of it that are going to be removed and certain parts that are going to stay. Or those stays could be lifted and these orders could go into effect. And so depending on the type of workforce you have, if you are in a multi-state operation, there's a lot of planning to do. There's a lot of decision making to be made. So the first step would probably to just, if you haven't already, to at least put kind of a task force together, right? And make sure you have the right people at the table who are going to be able to strategize and execute on your plan to the extent any one of these three orders does eventually go into effect. Donna, I know you and I work very closely and have worked very closely throughout this pandemic beginning in February of 2020. And now we're on the topic of vaccine mandates. And we, of course, internally and also partnering with our clients, we've had to make a number of decisions related to each one of these buckets and how we are going to comply with them. Donna, did you want to kind of share some of those key pivotal moments that you can think back on that maybe kept you up at night on the types of decisions that we had to make and how we had to help our clients?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Vanessa. So, I mean, starting with vaccines, if you're thinking about implementing a vaccine policy now, in light of everything that's been happening with these orders that have been stayed, what we strongly recommend is that you really just put some thought and some into the decision and into the process that you're going to build. We've seen several of our clients implementing internal campaigns to promote vaccines, and then following up with policies requiring vaccination for their workers, including their temporary staff. And once you decide to implement a vaccination policy, you need to think about how. How are you going to do that? How are you going to collect this data from your employees? To get the best results, make the process as easy as possible for your employees. It could be through the use of in-house surveys that you build, or apps, QR codes, whatever you do, just make it easy. And consider too, if you plan to integrate any of that data that you do collect into your HR systems for easier reporting. You want to think about your process for your current workforce as well as your new hires. And don't forget to build something into your recruitment processes so that your new hires aren't surprised by your requirement for a vaccine mandate, after you've offered them a job. Most of our clients require their employees to produce a copy of the vaccine card instead of just providing an attestation of the vaccination status. But remember that the vaccine card is a medical record, and it should be stored confidentially and separate from your personnel files. And be aware too that there are fraudulent cards out there. So it's a good idea to review those cards, for obvious signs of fraud, such as misspellings and things like that. Something else to keep in the back of your mind is the implication of booster shots. Currently, the CDC does not consider a booster shot as a requirement to be fully vaccinated. But if that changes, or if the vaccines expire, you'll want to make sure that the process that you build and the policy that you build can pivot to account for that. And lastly, I don't think that we can stress, and Vanessa, you can attest to this, the importance of consistency and communication, right? We've seen clients do a phenomenal job of communicating their vaccination programs, including messaging from senior leaders. So if you're thinking about creating a policy, consider establishing that committee that Vanessa was talking about that will stay on top of the legislation and the regulations so that you can make some really quick decisions as parameters change. And then always include your employment attorneys in your decision making, because it's just critical to have that resource.
Yeah, and Donna, I would say too, from a planning perspective, I see a lot of clients giving a lot of thought into the testing, right? So if that OSHA ETS does go into effect, or perhaps even the executive order 14042 could pivot, and they might, the courts may end up requiring that order to be revised to give the option for vaccination or testing or what have you. But I think that testing requirement is something that our clients' committees are going to have to put a lot of thought into from a planning perspective, right?
Absolutely. There's several different ways that you can look at testing, and depending upon your workforce and the size of your workforce, if you have a large population of people that need to be tested, we have some clients that are bringing almost like testing clinics on site, just to make it easy and convenient. We have some clients that we've talked with that are just doing more of the onesie twosies, where they're sending their employees maybe off to a local pharmacy or a local testing clinic, We even have some that might do like a virtual testing program over a Zoom call or something like that. There's many different ways of doing it, and it really just depends upon your workforce and the size of your workforce and what works best for you.
Yeah, and so making calls to see in your community what is actually available, what companies are out there that are now offering this type of service. Probably wouldn't ink any kind of contract right now until these orders actually do go into effect, if they do. But definitely putting a lot of thought and planning into how you're going to comply with that requirement to the extent we do end up having to comply with it.
I think that's an absolutely incredible overview. I mean, if I can summarize it back, I see plan for the worst, hope for the best, Vanessa. Certainly think about making it easy in terms of data collection and really knowing your market. Be organized and include your population. As you're saying, Donna, communication, over communication is key. And then always include the employment attorneys, because with a 480-page document on the OSHA side with so many things that could possibly change going forward, we anticipate lots and lots of revisions, and this being, something we're talking about for a long time into 2022. I think the overall message that I get from you guys is that this isn't going anywhere, and we need to. Everybody has a responsibility to act on it. Vanessa, you touched on something interesting for me there around, private employers putting in their own vaccination policies in order to, look at social perspective, or deciding that they want to do their own thing in order to protect their workforce in different ways. If we're in a situation where clients are adopting mandatory legal policies because they want to, is that okay? Is that still lawful? Is that possible?
Well, in law school, we took a whole class on how to answer questions like that, and the entire answer is it depends. And it depends because we have these if you're in a state or you work in multi-state operations, you have to know your state laws. And I can't emphasize this enough. So if you were part of that population in the early fall that adopted a vaccination policy on your own, or you already executed on one of the federal mandates that required mandatory vaccination, you have to know your state laws now, because if you decide that you want to proceed with a vaccination policy in your state, even though the federal orders and mandates are all up in the air, you can do so, but only in those jurisdictions that are allowing it. So this topic obviously got somewhat political between the federal and the state level, and that's one of the issues to be decided by courts. Is this a federal issue, or is this better to be handled by the states? And states are actually passing laws. Some of them are mirroring exactly what the federal order basically says, that, hey, or not necessarily that exactly how the federal order says, but they mirror it by saying, you can you can have your employees get vaccinated, but you have to offer medical and religious exemptions. Okay, that's not a big deal. That's kind of like the state of Alabama. However, there are some states like Florida, Montana, Texas, Tennessee that have adopted very, very strict laws on prohibiting mandatory vaccinations. So in those states, and a couple of them, you just can't do it, period. And then in a couple of others, you have to give them the option to be able to object for pretty much any reason that they want to. And then you have other states that have kind of similar tracking to, you can have the vaccine, but they have to have medical and religious exemptions. And in fact, some laws under these particular states have more medical and religious protection than the federal government would provide for under existing case law. So a couple of decisions to be made here too, right? First of all, if you're going to have a vaccination policy, does your state allow it? And if it does, knowing the mandatory medical and religious exemption rules, and how you're going to apply with that. If you're going to apply it in one state because one state allows it, but not in another state, how is that going to impact your policies and your workforce from an operational perspective? And then, of course, on this list too, I highlighted New York City. We kind of put a star there because that's the outlier. In all of these other states, they have varying rules that are kind of restricting vaccination policies. In New York City, we saw, I believe last week, they actually required now, at the end of December, they are rolling out a mandatory vaccination policy for private employers. And so we're watching this very closely, because not only are we going to have to help our clients get into compliance in that state or in that city for any contingent workers, but we're watching other jurisdictions, right? Because what we saw at the beginning of the pandemic last year, when New York or California passed something, a lot of other local jurisdictions and states started mirroring what they were doing. Maybe not in the same way, but some kind of modification. So we are watching this topic very closely, because you might be in a multi-state operation where in one state you can't do it, but in another state you have to do it.
I hear you absolutely loud and clear on that, and knowing your state laws. And I think, we're going to be joined by customers from both multi-state and small, medium populations within this group. And I think the overarching piece I hear here is just know the environment that you exist in, and probably be a little bit more risk averse if you're in multiple environments. Going back to the piece around knowing your laws, I mentioned a bit earlier, Donna, that we're talking to over 150 customers at the moment about their own vaccination policies, about how they protect their workforce and what they're aiming to do. Yeah. So we have the legal piece covered. Thank you, Vanessa, in terms of knowing ourselves. But what are some of the other things that we're seeing our clients do to tackle all things COVID at the moment? I'm thinking about, policies, incentives, some of the things you touched on before. What are we seeing, and are they including temporary workers? Is it uniform? How are you seeing the market respond at the moment?
Yep, absolutely. We are seeing a lot of our clients that are implementing policies, and some of those policies were a direct result of one of those mandates, and others weren't. Others, it was just because a client wanted to implement a policy, and it's been just an interesting last couple of months following all of this and looking at some of the best practices that we've seen and talking with some of our clients. We have seen some of our clients in areas where vaccination rates overall have been somewhat on the lower side, that they've been implementing some incentive programs, some cash incentive programs, in order to boost some of those rates. We've seen some clients that are bringing vaccination clinics right onto the worksite to make it really easy for people to get vaccinated, and even extending that offer to employees' family members. You just come in, bring the family, and get everybody vaccinated. So things like that, and then they're extending those things, those offerings to their temporary workforce as well. Again, just to make it easy for people. So it's been a real partnership. As our clients have implemented policies, we've partnered with them also to talk about some of the things to think about, like effective dates. You want to always keep in mind that you can't implement a policy that says, I need my entire workforce to be vaccinated by, let's just say, January 15th, right? Because there's not enough time for somebody who hasn't been vaccinated to go through the whole process. If somebody's getting a Moderna vaccination, it's a 28-day window between shots, 21 days for Pfizer. So you've got to build that in. If you're in the absence of any type of legislation, you have to decide as an organization, what is your definition of fully vaccinated, right? CDC says it's 2 shots or all of your shots plus 2 weeks. We've seen some clients that do something a little bit different. So it's starting with the basics, like what is your definition as an organization of fully vaccinated, and who does it apply to? Vanessa had mentioned the remote workers. If you have remote workers, or if you have employees that are working in a hybrid capacity, partially remote, partially in your office, are you going to have a different policy? You have to think about if you have workers that are client facing, your clients or your vendors. How will you build your policy for those individuals? And Vanessa talked about accommodations and exemptions from vaccination. And yes, you'll have employees who will request exemptions from any type of a vaccination policy due to a medical or a religious reason. But now, practically speaking, how are you going to manage that? What will be your process or your policy for approving those? We have seen some clients that require doctor's notes or personal statements from employees regarding religious beliefs. But keep in mind that there are some states that might prohibit that. So it goes back to knowing your state laws. We have seen some clients that just simply take an attestation of a medical or a religious exemption and then move on from there. But once you have the exemption approved, now your next step is there a reasonable accommodation that can be made for that worker so that they can continue to work? And that reasonable accommodation could be remote work, right? It could be that they continue to come into your office or your facility, but you've got COVID protocols that need to be very carefully followed, such as masking and social distancing and all the things that we've been doing, for the past 2 years practically. So looking at making sure that your policy includes some really solid guidance on approving those exemptions and then determining what accommodations can be made. And back to testing. Testing can also be an accommodation, right? If somebody can't be vaccinated or there's an approved exemption, it could be that there's a weekly testing component. And that is something that we've been partnering with our clients with as well. So whatever comes next in the pandemic, we don't know what's going to be next, but we'll be there ready to tackle it with everybody.
Johnny, I think you can appreciate that I'm sitting here thinking that we need to start a campaign where CFOs just send flowers to every HR person for their organizations, because you guys talk about needing an employment lawyer at the table, but I can't imagine going through this without someone like Donna, and she's not eligible for hire, folks. She's staying with Adecco.
I think right back at you. I could never have it without you.
This is why we bring the experts. I think that what you're hearing here is that this preparation and knowing your market is incredibly important. We as Adecco we touched on it. We've been working with our customers for months on this, ranging from those in New York to California to those that got in early, mandating their own vaccination policies. And what we've done with our customer base is really try to educate back on the current state and knowing their own market. We have a wonderful tool that we built out, Adecco Analytics, which is a live market intel pool. It has data coming from both the BLS, social scrapers, and our own massive Adecco data lake around what's happening within local markets. The tool itself was built really to counterbalance some of the benefits improvements that we saw earlier this year around salary rates, supply and demand, gender and diversity metrics, and then also what was the general pay rate within a local community. That went down to zip code level. We've now recently enhanced that to also include vaccination rates within the state, because what we're seeing with our customer base is that as soon as these policies change, because they're not being federally mandated nor driven necessarily the same way within states, it's having pretty significant impacts on customers. I can name one large call center business that we work with who have absolutely mandated vaccination status even for remote workers. We're having to speak to about 50 to 60% more people nationally to get them into jobs for this customer than for our other call center businesses who haven't mandated vaccination. Similar to what Donna was saying around partnership and incentivization for the temporary community, most of our workers are on the temporary side. And so when they're excluded or there's a barrier to entry for them to be handled in the same way as the direct hire, the workforce members of a labor population, we see huge walk-off rates. Because if I have to travel to get tested, if I see all my colleagues being vaccinated, but I'm not eligible and have to pay for it myself, with the candidate shortage that we have today, I'm probably going to go and look for a job somewhere else. So the impacts are very real for our customers as well. And the thing that I'm hearing from both of you is obviously know your market, but work very, very closely with HR because they care about our people. Have a clear policy for all of your people, not just the direct hire population. And then also just spend a lot of time being prepared, because this is going to keep changing a lot as the year goes on. And I really feel that, having lived through the last 2 months with you, Donna and Vanessa, looking at our own population and thinking about the accommodations and then the requests and all the work that we've done for it just to be stayed last week, I'd say that HR team, Vanessa, doesn't need a bunch of flowers. It probably needs a bottle of wine. So, it's been a lot. It's been a lot. And we really appreciate the work that's gone on with you, and our customers appreciate you as well.
Thank you.
So we've talked a lot about the kind of the overview, a lot of things that are moving, etc. and we're going to share some pieces back at the end of this session. But where do you two like to get kind of your information from? What keeps you on the cutting edge of this kind of ever-changing environment? Where do you read up?
Yeah, so this one, I wanted to kind of put these actual links where clients can go to find specific information and maybe not have to spend so much money on law firms. The first three are your federal links. So I put one in there. The Safer Federal Workforce is the one for Federal Executive Order 14042. You can find all the FAQs on how to interpret the requirements. And of course, it stayed. However, it's the one you're going to want to pay attention to if there's some kind of lift of that stay or if there's changes made to it. The second one is the OSHA one that governs that is the one that talks about OSHA ETS. Again, tons of FAQs. You don't have to read the 480-page opinion or order like I did. You can just go straight to those FAQs and have the information really deciphered for you. The third one is the CMS. That one governs, remember, the healthcare workspace that receives federal funding. And then the final three, I'm not necessarily endorsing these law firms by any means. However, a lot of things COVID fell on employment lawyers. So employment law firms have a really good handle on all things COVID. And a couple of my favorites that I like to go to are Fisher and Phillips and Ogletree. Fisher and Phillips just has an amazing FAQ website themselves that they update quite regularly. They also have an integrated employer map on vaccine mandates. So if you're a visual and you like seeing the map of the US that shows, okay, in this state you can do this and in this state you can do that, they have a great tool on their website. You can also click a table if you want to see it kind of in an Excel spreadsheet format. I do recommend going and doing your own independent research and of course talking to your lawyers in your state before you implement something specifically from that website. And then, of course, Ogletree as well. They have a great COVID-19 resource center, and they actually, for small and medium-sized clients, it's a great resource. You can pay a flat fee, and they'll give you policies that are compliant with. Remember, there's still like the OSHA order that requires you to have a safety plan, right? That's just basic OSHA 101, OSHA 101. So they do have those kinds of policies in place for all things COVID, social distancing, masks, all the things that we've been talking about for almost 2 years now. So you can go there and kind of buy a package deal at a very reasonable price. So those are kind of my favorites. Donna, I don't know if there was one that I didn't put in there that you like. Maybe the EEOC FAQs also would be a really good one.
EEOC is a good one, and these are the ones that I use as well. And then, of course, I just call you.
No, that's wonderful and a great overview with some very important resources that we can share out too. So thank you so much. This has been, I think, a really impressive and educative overview, not least for me, in terms of kind of what we should be doing in an ever-changing market. If I could ask, what's the one take? We have a lot of people listening to this webinar. You're the experts, as I said at the start. What would be your kind of one piece of advice, the one takeaway that people should kind of take back to their desk and start thinking about as they work in this ever-changing environment toward the holiday break and then into next year?
I would say, Johnny, what stuck with me was that hope for the best and prepare for the worst. And in the spirit of that, really just be thinking about how you're going to collect vaccination cards and how you're going to implement that testing to the extent you're going to be in a jurisdiction that's going to require it.
Yep. I would echo that, doing anything that you can to get ahead of it, to stay ahead of it. These mandates, they hit so fast. And, with some of them, they had very, very small lead time. And so, just trying to avoid being in that situation where you're chasing the effective date.
That's really wonderful advice. So thank you, everyone, for joining our first Ask the Expert session on how to react to a vaccine mandate, or not mandate, as we might be in at the moment. I suggest, if it's okay with you, Vanessa and Donna, we tried to get back together in mid to late January and do a follow-up on this and see kind of what the state of the union is at that point. I think it would be good for our customers and candidates to hear kind of how things have progressed over the last month. So if you'll commit to that, I'd love to see you in a month or so.
Sure.
Sure.
Wonderful. And then for everyone else who's listening in, Adecco is here to help and support. We have clearly an amazing team who's looking at this on a regular basis, and there's a lot of an ever evolving market out there. There's ways to get in touch with us. So you can email www.adeccousa.com. You can go to that website, sorry. You can email howcanwehelp@adeccousa.com. And what we can do in response to that is send back the link to the websites and some other information. And then there's also a telephone number where you can call and speak to us, and we're prepared to offer advice to our customer base around how to kind of continue to support with this ever-changing market. So thank you for joining us. I've really enjoyed the session. Thank you, Vanessa. Thank you, Donna. Have a safe and happy holidays, everybody, and we'll look forward to catching up in the new year.